Alternative licensure is one tiny piece in the overall reform package. It became the hot button in Minnesota, but that was because the Education Minnesota folks chose to make it so.
Democratic Visions is handmade in Eden Prairie and Minnetonka by DFL Senate District 42.
We are indeed fortunate to have Senator Terri Bonoff with us on Democratic Visions. First elected to the Senate in 2005, Senator Bonoff represents parts of Minnetonka, Plymouth, and all of Medicine Lake, and is a dedicated and diligent public servant. Welcome to the program, Terri.
Thank you very much, Tim.
The first thing I want to talk about is the legislative session, which just wrapped up. And I got to tell you, as an outsider looking in, I think that the interests of the state were almost sacrificed by aspirations of individuals of various parties for further elective office. Is that too much of a gross exaggeration?
I don't know if I would say sacrifice, but I think you certainly have a point. When you look at how many legislators were running for higher office, you can easily see how personal ambition got in the way of doing what's best for Minnesotans. And I think that, you know, whether you're Tom Emmer running for governor, Margaret Anderson Kelleher running for governor, Tom Bach, John Marty in the Senate,
Tim Pawlenty.
Tim Pawlenty, exactly, running for president. There were a lot of things going on that weren't exactly what they seem.
Well, it looks to me like it's a fairly poor idea to be continuing to borrow money from our school districts to fund a substantial part of that budget gap. Did you share that observation?
Well, Tim, it's complicated. You know, you're talking about almost $2 billion. So if you had not done the borrowing from school districts, in essence, in 1 year's time, you would have had to make very significant cuts. You could say, well, you could raise taxes, but we knew actually that wasn't an option because our governor let us know that, and we have found out that he has the power to follow through with that. So we would have been left with cuts. You can restructure and re-engineer, but not that quickly. So in fact, in this case, while I hated borrowing from school districts more than anybody, as I sit on the Education Committee where I serve as vice chair, I thought that was preferable to making deep cuts to school districts where they frankly wouldn't have been able to recover, in my opinion.
Well, now, in the next biennium, beginning in mid-2011, aren't we looking at a projected deficit of $5, $6, $7, $8 billion?
We are, but then again, those numbers get thrown around, and it's important to understand what's part of them. So, for example, the $2 billion, that's currently back on the books when you're looking at 5. So, in fact, if you were to say you were going to use that shift for a little while until we got back on our feet, that takes the 5.4 down to 3.4. In addition, the other unallotments that the governor did are also in that number. So if you'd say, well, you're going to live with those, now you're down somewhere to 2.4. Now you're dealing with a size that perhaps you really could do some significant restructuring and re-engineering so that you could come up with a budget that is in structural balance. I think there are significant risks in the coming months and in the next couple of years. So I'm looking for some decisive action about how, in fact, to look at our cost structure, how to get our overall cost of government down without sacrificing what we value most. And I would say what we value most has to be our children, our education system, and those who are most in need.
Let's talk about the latter.
Okay.
And because that's one of the things that I think raises some people's ire, and that is that the Democrats and the Republicans were unable to agree on providing health care for the poor that would have been largely funded by the federal government. Give us an inside view of what took place there.
Oh man, that was something that was mystifying. Here we have a certain population, the most vulnerable of all, these, you know, single, very poor, young or old adults that have...
Isn't it $8,000 or less?
Right, exactly, living on $8,000 or less. We are currently serving them on our state programs. We had an opportunity because of the new federal health care, we had an opportunity to enroll them directly into Medicaid. By doing that, it would have cost us a little bit of money, but what they say is for every $1, we would have gotten back $7.50. We would have had an additional $1.4 billion coming from the federal government to cover caring for that very vulnerable population.
Excuse me, I think I opened up my dictionary under no-brainer and I see that right there. What happened? Why didn't that get passed?
Politics. I mean, that's absolutely it. The House and Senate Republicans tied it to, quote, Obamacare. And they said that if we were to do this, we would in fact be endorsing President Obama's new health care plan. That's ridiculous. These are people that currently we're paying for under, with state dollars that we could have used the kind of cost sharing that many states have been doing for years. We've always known that we get less of our fair share in health care dollars from the federal government than most states. This would have stopped that, and it would have been a more level playing field at a time when we desperately needed it.
Well, I know that you describe yourself as a fiscally conservative Democrat, and I know that you've authored legislation in the past dealing with the reforms in our educational system. What went on from your perspective with education at this last session?
Well, very disappointing, I would say that. If you recall, I was here last year talking about the work I did around shared services,
yes,
and that work was about lowering the overall cost to deliver education, so that if you take, for example, the business services out of the individual school districts, you could instead deliver them regionally. That was stopped by various special interests, and so I approached that from a different perspective this year, and I won't go into that, but I didn't give up on it. I just approached it differently. But I was more directed towards education policy reform this session because President Obama and Secretary Arne Duncan put forward Race to the Top. That became a wonderful catalyst for states all over this country to say, now is the time to put together real policies that can close the achievement gap.
I know that one of the President Obama's methods of addressing that is alternate licensure. But I've always had sort of a disconnect, and can you explain it to me?
Alternative licensure is one tiny piece, by the way, in the overall reform package. It became the hot button in Minnesota, but that was because the Education Minnesota folks chose to make it so. So I'll answer the question, but I want you to know that in no way is President Obama saying the key to closing the achievement gap is alternative licensure.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. So what does alternative licensure have to do with closing the achievement gap? Primarily, programs that utilize the alternative way to get young people into the classroom or even mid-career professionals, but let's start with the young people, is through an extremely effective and exciting program called Teach for America. Teach for America recruits from the best schools in our country. Their mission is to take these young people, give them extreme amount of very intensive training, and put them in the toughest places in our country. Put them in urban areas, in rural areas, in places where poverty is predominant. And then they say to them, you cannot accept failure. You must make sure these students succeed. And they have been shockingly successful. I have 4 different studies that can show you how those students have achieved far beyond what traditional teachers in our regular classrooms have been able to achieve with those students. We in Minnesota wanted that opportunity. We have the 2nd highest achievement gap in the country. We want to be able to have a robust Teach for America program in our schools where our students face the greatest risk. And those districts that have those students, they wanted us to have that. They were my partners in working on that. I'm certain we'll get this done next year.
Democratic Visions is handmade in Eden Prairie and Minnetonka by DFL Senate District 42. Norbert Gurnis, Chair. Democratic Visions can also be seen on our website, dflsd42.org.